Virginia, 1828. The fields stretched wide and gold, tobacco leaves glistening beneath the first light of dawn. The Whitby plantation sat at the heart of it all, its house a looming brick monument, polished white columns rising above the riverbank as if announcing both pride and permanence. Travelers passing through whispered that no soil in the county grew richer, no family commanded greater respect. The Whitby name was carried with an air of inevitability, as though their fortune had been blessed by God himself. Yet behind the tidy ledgers and Sunday sermons, rumors clung to the estate like a stain that refused to wash out. The wealth was unquestionable. Wagons full of harvested tobacco rolled out toward Richmond markets, each bale marked with the Whitby crest, a coiled serpent around a sheaf of grain. Elias Whitby, the patriarch, boasted that no family could match their yield year after year, even when other planters struggled with drought or blight. Neighbors asked, in hushed tones, what his secret might be, whether some ingenious method of cultivation, or perhaps a blessing of providence. But in taverns and at night around hearths, darker explanations surfaced. They said the soil itself was not natural, that it had been fortified, though none dared to explain how. On the surface, life at the estate seemed an endless procession of prosperity. The Whitby house glowed with candlelight during feasts, its windows spilling warmth into the cold Virginia nights. Ministers were invited to offer prayers before each banquet, praising the family's generosity in feeding the county's dignitaries. Yet the enslaved who prepared the meals moved silently, their eyes averted, their presence almost erased from the grand spectacle. It was as if the Whitbys had mastered the art of showing plenty while hiding absence. To the guests, it was proof of success. To those who labored unseen, it was a reminder of how little their own existence counted. The story, as preserved in county records and oral traditions, begins with a simple assertion. The Whitby fortune was forged not only in honest earth, but in unmarked soil, soil enriched by what was never meant to be buried there. Every account that survives, whether in brittle court documents or the recollections of those who escaped bondage, carries the same refrain, that prosperity was purchased, at the expense of lives silenced and concealed beneath the fields themselves. Even the landscape seemed complicit. The fields rolled gently outward, smooth and orderly, as if no disruption had ever marred them. Visitors often remarked on the quiet beauty of the land, never realizing that beneath their feet lay stories that had been hidden, pressed down like seed. The Whitby legacy was one of contrast, of public virtue displayed proudly, and of private sins buried deep. In time, those contrasts would sharpen into accusations, disappearances, and revelations that refused to stay covered. Tonight, as we revisit the Whitby lineage and the soil that built its fortune, remember that every shining facade is balanced by shadows cast behind it. Where there is wealth, there may also be silence. Where there is reverence, there may also be fear. And if these fields were indeed fertilized with more than rain and labor, then perhaps they remember what men tried so hard to forget. Before we begin, a question for you, the listener. Where are you listening from tonight? In sharing stories such as this, we become not just keepers of history, but witnesses to it, and what we choose to believe, or to question, carries weight of its own. This account is a reconstruction, pieced together from scattered archives, letters, and oral histories. Some documents survive only in fragments. Others have been transcribed by later hands, and many details remain contested. What you are about to hear is a dramatization based on those records, not a verbatim truth preserved without error. We handle this material with care, because of the weight it carries, accounts of enslavement, violence, and loss that should never be sensationalized, yet must not be erased. The past does not lend itself to certainty. Newspapers of the period were often little more than the mouthpieces of landowners. Churches recorded what served their congregations, and officials had vested interest in preserving order rather than truth. In telling the Whitby story, we move between what was said publicly, what was whispered privately, and what was later uncovered in hidden ledgers and sealed testimonies. At times, the voices of the enslaved reach us only indirectly, their words filtered through clerks, overseers, or investigators who never considered them equals. This is both the tragedy and the responsibility, to acknowledge the limits of what survives, while refusing to smooth away the brutal edges of what likely occurred. It is important to note that the accounts ahead contain descriptions of death, exploitation, and the desecration of human remains. These elements are integral to understanding how the Whitby estate built its fortune. Yet they may be deeply distressing, Listeners who find such content overwhelming are encouraged to step away. The history itself is immovable, but your well-being is not to be risked in the hearing of it. There is also the matter of dramatization. Where dialogue appears, it is drawn from letters, depositions, or reports, paraphrased only where the original phrasing has been lost. Where emotion is described, it rests on context and consistency rather than invention. And where silence is noted, gaps in the record, omissions in the ledgers, that silence speaks volumes on its own. We acknowledge openly that this reconstruction cannot claim neutrality. It is shaped by our time, our ethics, and our insistence that the voices of the silenced must be raised, even if imperfectly. In the sections that follow, you will hear the contrasts laid bare. The prosperous fields against the graves beneath them, the sermons of righteousness against the whispers of wrongdoing, the official records that insist upon innocence against the hidden documents that reveal complicity. This tension is not decoration, it is the heart of the story. If the Whitby estate seemed a house built upon fertile land, then we must consider what nourished that fertility, and who was compelled to pay the price. With these cautions in place, we step from the solemn duty of disclosure into the substance of the tale. The Whitby plantation does not exist today in the form it once did. Its bricks crumbled and its fields divided among other owners. But its story survives precisely because it was never meant to be told. Every time a ledger was sealed, every time a deposition was struck from the record, a piece of truth slipped into shadow. Tonight, we attempt to bring some of those shadows into the light, not to sensationalize, but to remember. In the Virginia of 1828, the land itself appeared to define the lives of all who walked upon it. Vast fields of tobacco and corn rippled like oceans under the southern sun, feeding not only families but entire economies built upon their yield. Yet this prosperity was not shared. It belonged to a planter class whose homes were raised in brick and timber, whose parlors echoed with polished sermons of morality, and whose wealth was measured not only in acres but in lives owned. Virginia stood at a crossroads in those years. The state still considered itself the cradle of the Republic, home to Jefferson, Madison, and Washington, but its ideals of liberty rang hollow when weighed against the reality of slavery. At the county level, small farmers labored with their own hands, while elite estates thrived on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children. For every courthouse sermon on Christian duty, there were whispered accounts of auctions where families were broken apart with a casual strike of a gavel. The contradiction was not hidden. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. The geography of the Whitby estate reflected this divide. To the west, the Blue Ridge stood as a rugged wall, its peaks wrapped in mist that promised isolation and secrecy. To the east, the James River flowed broad and steady, carrying crops to the markets of Richmond. Between these points lay the plantation lands, rolling fields, bordered by swamps and thickets where the cries of whippoorwills mixed with less natural sounds in the night. Neighbors admired the Whitbys' ability to coax extraordinary yields from the same soil that gave their own farms only meager return. They spoke of God's blessing, but among the enslaved, another interpretation circulated quietly. The land was not blessed, but cursed. Religion played a powerful role in maintaining order. Each Sunday, Elias Whitby welcomed ministers to preach from his drawing room, hymns rising from polished instruments, while enslaved servants waited in silence outside the doors. The sermons emphasized stewardship, obedience, and divine order, reinforcing the idea that the planter's authority was not merely legal, but holy. Yet the enslaved people carried their own spiritual world, one stitched together from fragments of African traditions and whispered readings from smuggled scraps of scripture. In the fields at dusk, when overseers retreated to their suppers, songs rose low and mournful, their meanings layered, a hymn of deliverance to some ears, a map of escape routes to others. Economically, Virginia was in flux. Cotton was beginning to shift the center of wealth further south. But in 1828, tobacco remained the crop of prestige. Prices were volatile, and many estates suffered from exhausted soil. That the Whitbys showed no such decline only fueled speculation. Some neighbors credited innovative crop rotation. Others suggested the family trafficked in secrets darker than agriculture. By then, a few missing persons had already been noted in whispers, enslaved individuals who seemed simply to vanish from Whitby records without being sold, freed or buried with ceremony. The official ledger spoke of stability. Oral tradition spoke of something else. Socially, fear was a constant companion. In 1822, only a few years prior, the failed Denmark-Vesey conspiracy in South Carolina had reached Virginia's newspapers, sparking panic among planters. Rumors of uprisings lingered in every conversation about security. The Whitbys, like others, expanded patrols and enforced curfews on the enslaved population. Yet in doing so, they tightened the silence around their estate. Outsiders were discouraged from entering, and those who did spoke of a stillness, an unnatural hush that clung to the fields as if even the birds kept their distance. The world of 1828, Virginia was therefore a land of contrasts, beauty and brutality, piety and hypocrisy, abundance and absence. To walk through the county courthouse on a market day was to see merchants exchanging goods and gossip, ministers invoking God's blessing, and planters boasting of their crops. Yet just beyond the town square, fields stretched out that had absorbed more than rainwater. Beneath the order and prosperity lay something unspoken, something that men like Elias Whitby depended upon but never admitted aloud. This was the environment in which the Whitby fortune flourished, a society eager to believe in providence while averting its eyes from the cost. And it is here, in this atmosphere of contradictions, that the first documented suspicions began to take root. Elias Whitby was not born into obscurity. By 1828, he had already carved a place among Virginia's landed elite, a man spoken of with both respect and unease. He was tall and lean, his frame described in letters as spare as a pine, but rooted deep in the soil, he claimed. His eyes were a pale gray, and many who met them remarked that they seemed to weigh and measure a person without a word. His manner in public was gracious, even courtly, yet beneath the polish there lingered something that unsettled even his closest neighbors. Some called it ambition, others less charitably called it hunger. Born in the final years of the 18th century, Elias inherited not only land but also the restless drive of his forebears. The Whitby name was already known in the county by the time of his majority, but it was Elias who expanded the holdings, purchasing adjoining parcels of exhausted farmland and somehow reviving them into thriving plots. By the time he reached his mid-30s, he had transformed a modest inheritance into one of the wealthiest estates in the region. Planters in neighboring counties both admired and resented his success, for it cast into sharp relief their own struggles with failing soil and mounting debts. In his household, Elias ruled with calculated severity. His wife, Margaret, was often seen only in the parlor during Sunday sermons or at seasonal gatherings. She was described as pale, almost spectral, and spoke rarely in public. Some speculated that illness kept her withdrawn. Others believed she had learned silence as the safest posture beside her husband. The Whitby children, 3 in number, were raised with tutors and kept from mingling too freely with other planter families. What little correspondence survives from them suggests a household where formality masked unease, where affection was rationed as carefully as coin. Elias cultivated the image of a man of God. He donated to local churches, financed a new bell for the parish, and invited ministers to his home to preach. These gestures earned him a reputation as a benefactor of faith. Yet the enslaved men and women on his estate knew another face of the master. Overseer journals and oral recollections point to a man who demanded absolute obedience, who punished small infractions with an intensity that seemed less about correction and more about domination. Whispers carried beyond the fields, about nocturnal gatherings, about punishments enacted away from the overseer's sight, about disappearances never explained. In county records, Elias appeared almost spotless. He paid his debts on time, contributed to civic projects, and kept his estate in exemplary order. Magistrates wrote of him as upright and industrious. But law and order in Virginia in those years often served as the veil that covered the darker dealings of its most powerful citizens. When enslaved men or women vanished from the Whitby estate, no official questions were raised. When accounts of strange sounds from the fields reached the sheriff, they were dismissed as the talk of superstitious laborers. In every respect that mattered to the public eye, Elias Whitby was above suspicion. What made him singular, perhaps, was the way he seemed to merge piety with pragmatism. He quoted scripture fluently, invoking parables of stewardship and reward, all while driving his enslaved laborers harder than any neighbor dared. At the harvest banquets he would rise, a glass of Virginia brandy in hand, and declare that the land rewards those who serve it faithfully. To some, It was a benign proverb. To others, it carried an edge, as though the land itself demanded more than sweat. In later years, when testimonies were taken from surviving witnesses, a chilling portrait emerged. Elias Whitby was remembered not for fits of rage or overt cruelty, but for his calm precision. He never raised his voice. He measured his words as he measured his crops. If a man vanished, he did not bluster. He simply adjusted his ledgers, struck out a name, and continued as though the absence were part of the natural cycle of the estate. To the enslaved, this coldness was more terrifying than anger. It suggested that human lives were, to him, no different from seed or soil, things to be used, exhausted, and replaced. It was within this character, publicly virtuous, privately calculating, that the seeds of the Whitby lineage's darkest chapters were sown. Elias Whitby embodied the contradictions of his time: faith and fear, generosity and cruelty, cultivation and consumption. To his neighbors, he was the very image of prosperity. To those who served under him, he was a shadow that walked in daylight. And as the years advanced, that shadow grew long over the land, stretching into places where it could no longer be ignored. The Whitby Harvest Banquet of 1828 was remembered in county memory as both magnificent and unsettling. It was held on an October evening, when the fields stood stripped of their bounty and wagons of tobacco had already been dispatched to Richmond. Elias Whitby, with a magnanimous gesture, invited the wealthiest planners, magistrates, and ministers of the county to dine at his estate. Invitations were hand-delivered on thick cream paper, bearing the Whitby crest of the coiled serpent. The message was clear. Attendance was not merely a courtesy, but a recognition of status. To decline was to risk being seen as outside Whitby favor. Guests arrived in carriages that rattled down the oak-lined lane, lamps swaying in the dusk. The house glowed like a beacon, its windows spilling golden light. Musicians, hired from the city, played violins. In the entry hall as couples stepped across polished floors. In the dining room, the tables stretched nearly the length of the chamber, draped in linen, crowded with silver platters of roasted fowl, stewed venison, and sugared fruits imported at no small cost. Every detail was calculated to impress, to display abundance at a time when many estates struggled. What went unnoticed at first was who was missing. Servants attended to the feast, but fewer than usual. The most seasoned house servants, familiar faces at past gatherings, were absent. When one guest asked after them, Elias smiled thinly and replied that rotation keeps the household sharp. The matter was dropped. In the hum of conversation, yet a faint disquiet stirred among those observant enough to notice the silences in the room. The evening was filled with speeches. Elias rose with his glass, offering praise to Providence for blessing his lands with fertility. He quoted scripture about the sower and the reaper, reminding all present that the earth returns bounty to those who labor faithfully. Applause followed, though some remarked afterward that his words carried a strange undertone, as though he spoke not only of crops but of something deeper, something unsaid. The feast itself seemed endless. Platters were refilled before they emptied. Casks of brandy were opened one after another, and the musicians played until their fingers ached. Yet amidst the plenty, shadows clung at the edges. Some guests whispered about the drawn look on Margaret Whitby's face as she sat silent at her husband's side, sipping nothing, barely eating. Others noticed the way Elias's eldest son stared down at his plate, avoiding the gaze of the assembled men. The atmosphere was festive, but beneath it ran a current of unease, like a river beneath ice. In the days that followed, rumors began to spread. Several enslaved workers from the Whitby estate, seen alive only weeks before, were no longer accounted for. Their names vanished from the overseer's daily rolls. No sales were recorded at the courthouse. No bills of manumission were filed. No burials marked in the churchyard. It was as though they had been erased. When whispers reached the sheriff, he dismissed them as inventory adjustments. But among the enslaved, stories circulated of night wagons leaving the estate, of earth freshly turned in places no crops were planted. An artifact survives from this period. The guest list of the banquet, found decades later among county papers. Names of prominent families are neatly written, each marked with the host's annotations. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, appear faint marks beside certain entries, small crosses, and in 2 cases, names of servants written and then scratched out with ink so heavy it pierced the paper. No explanation accompanies these markings, Yet their presence speaks louder than silence. It is as though the record itself resisted being too complete, leaving gaps that invite suspicion. The contrast of the banquet remains haunting. A table overflowing with food while lives disappeared into the earth. The sound of violins while the fields outside hid secrets beneath their soil. The laughter of men drunk on brandy while mothers within the cabins wept for those who did not return. What was celebrated as prosperity in the parlor was, in the quarters, experienced as absence and dread for the county's elite. The night passed into memory as a triumph of Whitby hospitality. For those who labored unseen, it was the beginning of a pattern, the first of several incidents that would whisper of something far darker than lavish feasts. And though no accusation could yet be spoken aloud, a seed of suspicion had been planted, a seed that, like all things in the Virginia soil, would in time bear fruit. It was nearly a decade after the Whitby banquet when the second incident forced itself into memory. By then, 1837, Elias Whitby's fortune was greater than ever. His barns swollen with tobacco, his family's name spoken in reverence across the county. But prosperity could not keep children from playing, nor could reputation silence what the earth chose to return. On a bright spring afternoon, a group of boys from neighboring farms strayed into the far fields of the Whitby estate. Their game was innocent, mock battles with sticks for muskets, the kind of rough play that left trousers muddied and mothers exasperated. One boy stumbled over what he thought was a tree root protruding from the soil. When he bent to tug it free, the ground gave way, revealing not wood but the pale curve of a human jawbone, teeth still set in a half-grin that no living face had worn. The discovery spread like fire among the children. They unearthed more fragments, long bones brittle and sun-bleached, smaller pieces that suggested not one skeleton but several. The boys carried their finds back toward the lane, laughing at first in the way children laugh at anything strange, until one of the younger ones began to cry, realizing that the bones were not relics of animals but of people. By the time an overseer spotted them, word had already reached the cabins. Within hours, whispers carried faster than the spring wind. The soil itself was returning what had been hidden. Sheriff Matthew Clyne was summoned reluctantly. He arrived on horseback, his boots spattered with mud, his face set in the weary expression of a man who had dealt with Whitby business before. The bones were collected and laid upon a canvas sheet. A local physician, pressed into service, examined them briefly and declared them ancient remains, likely of native origin, disturbed by the tilling of fields. His verdict was accepted too quickly, as if everyone present preferred to hear that explanation rather than probe further. No records were filed beyond a single-page note in the sheriff's book. Bones found, presumed of old Indian burial. No threat to public order. That note survives, faded ink upon yellowing paper with margins unusually bare. Normally, Clyne scribbled remarks about weather, about distances ridden, about complaints received. But here, the silence of the page is as telling as its content. Only the essential words remain, almost as if written under watchful eyes. The enslaved community, however, carried a different understanding. Songs that spring took on a sharper edge, lyrics bent into metaphors that spoke of the earth, giving back what the master takes. Children were warned not to wander into the far fields, not because of snakes or thorns, but because the ground remembers. Elders muttered prayers over the spots where soil had been disturbed, blending Christian hymns with older rhythms, as though to appease spirits restless beneath the rows of tobacco. In town, gossip surfaced but never bloomed. Merchants and planters mentioned the bones in low voices, often with a nervous laugh, as if to rob the story of its teeth. The official narrative, that these were ancient burials, nothing more, was repeated until it hardened into something approaching fact. To question it openly was to risk drawing suspicion not on Whitby but on oneself. And so the discovery was folded into silence, noted and dismissed, even as unease lingered like smoke after a fire. The contrast of this incident was stark. For the children, it was a game turned to horror, innocence broken by the weight of history beneath their feet. For the authorities, it was an inconvenience to be explained away, a matter better forgotten than investigated. And for those who lived enslaved on the estate, it was confirmation of what they had long known. The soil was not only fertile but haunted, nourished by what should never have been buried there. Though the bones were quickly carted off and interred, without ceremony, in a shallow communal grave near the edge of the woods. The whispers did not fade. Instead, they deepened, weaving into local folklore that the Whitby lands were cursed, that the ground itself rejected secrecy. What was meant to be hidden had begun to surface, and though the county closed its eyes, the fields had started to speak. It was the fire that finally forced the county to look upon what it had long refused to see. The blaze began in the summer of 1841 in one of the tobacco barns at the southern edge of the Whitby estate. These barns were built stout and tall, meant for curing leaves in controlled heat, their wooden frames coated in years of resin and dust. They were tinder waiting for a spark. When the flames rose that night, they lit the fields with an orange glare visible from neighboring farms, and the air filled with the smell of burning leaf. Sweet at first, then acrid, then suffocating. Neighbors rushed to the scene, some carrying buckets, others simply drawn by the light. The enslaved were driven to form a line to contain the fire, passing water in pails too small to matter against the inferno. Amidst the chaos, several men pulled back, heavy beams to keep the blaze from spreading to adjoining structures. It was then, as collapsing timbers exposed the packed earth beneath, that the true horror was revealed. The barn floor, blackened and buckling, gave way to a hidden pit. As flames licked the edges, shapes were uncovered, skeletal forms, tangled together, sealed beneath layers of ash and dirt. The crowd froze, stunned into silence. One man swore aloud that he saw a child's skull among them. Smaller than the rest, others muttered prayers, crossing themselves against the sight. The fire had uncovered what plows and shovels had not. A grave beneath a barn that had no business being there. Sheriff Matthew Clyne was summoned again, his presence now unavoidable. He arrived as dawn broke, the barn reduced to smoldering ruins. The stench of charred tobacco mingled with something sharper, something that clung to the back of the throat. Witnesses pressed him for answers, demanding an explanation for the bones. Clyne, pale and sweating, ordered the remains covered with canvas and guarded until proper examination could be made. Yet even as he spoke, Whitby himself stood nearby, calm, his arms folded across his chest. He assured the onlookers that the fire had disturbed old ground, perhaps an ancient settlement. His voice carried steady authority, and many, eager to close their eyes to what they had seen, nodded along, but not all were convinced. The enslaved whispered among themselves that these were no ancient remains. They knew who had gone missing. They knew which names had been struck from the rolls. For them, the fire was not an accident, but a revelation, the earth itself forcing what had been hidden into sight. Songs began to circulate in the cabins, darker now, filled with warnings. The barns cannot hold what the soil will tell. An artifact from this moment survives in fragments, a report drafted by Sheriff Clyne, preserved in county archives. In it, he records the fire as accidental, caused by a lantern overturned during curing. The discovery of bones is noted briefly, dismissed as likely remnants of native habitation, disturbed by subsidence. Yet, scholars who examined the document later noted faint smudges in the margin, perhaps an attempt at erasure. One line, barely legible, reads, "More than a dozen, perhaps scores." This incident marked the first time the wider community confronted, however briefly, the possibility that Whitby's wealth was entwined with death. The contrast was glaring. A barn meant to preserve crops, instead exposing the bodies of the lost. A fire meant to consume tobacco, instead illuminating the buried truth. A community eager for order forced to reckon with disorder lying beneath its feet. Still, the county chose silence. After the ruins cooled, the pit was hastily filled. The bones gathered and carted away under guard. No inquiry was pursued, no charges filed. Ministers preached that Sunday on the fragility of life, on fire as both punishment and purification, but not a word was spoken of the barn. For the official record, the Whitby estate remained untarnished. For those who had seen the remains with their own eyes, it was a memory that could never be erased. Even if they dared not speak of it again, the fire was a rupture, a glimpse of the truth beneath Whitby prosperity. Yet like the bones themselves, the revelation was quickly buried. It would not be the last time the land tried to speak, nor the last time men in power tried to silence it. Sheriff Matthew Clyne was not a man who enjoyed attention. By the time of the tobacco barn fire, he had served nearly 15 years in the county, a figure more respected for his endurance than admired for his courage. He was practical, slow-spoken, and careful never to step too far, outside the expectations of landowners whose taxes paid his wages. Yet behind the deliberate calm he wore in public The Whitby affair gnawed at him like a worm in fruit. The morning after the fire, Clyne sat in his office above the courthouse, the smell of ash still clinging to his coat. On the table before him lay his half-completed report. He had written the words, "Remains discovered," but left the rest blank, his pen hovering as though unwilling to give shape to the truth. He had seen the bones himself, the collapsed pit gaping open like a wound, and he knew they were too many, too recent, to belong to any ancient burial. Yet to commit that knowledge to paper was to set himself against Elias Whitby, a man whose wealth reached into every corner of the county. Neighbors had already begun to whisper, and magistrates pressed Clyne to resolve the matter quickly. An accident, they urged, an old burial site disturbed. Put it to rest before panic takes root. They spoke of stability, of reputation, of how fragile trust could be in a county dependent on order. But in private moments, Clyne admitted to his deputy that he feared what might happen if the truth was spoken aloud. "Men like Whitby," he muttered, "they do not rise clean." But who dares to pull them down? Accounts from this period suggest the sheriff attempted quiet inquiries. He questioned 2 overseers, both of whom denied knowledge of the pit beneath the barn. Their denials were rehearsed, their eyes averted. When pressed further, one claimed that the ground there is soft, always has been. Another swore he had heard that native burials dotted the land long before Whitby ownership. Neither man spoke of the missing enslaved whose names had been quietly erased from the rolls. Clyne also sought out members of the enslaved community, though such conversations were fraught with danger. One elderly woman, later identified in church records as Dinah, told him in hushed tones that the master feeds the soil what is not his to take. When Clyne asked her to explain, she simply shook her head, whispering, "If I speak more, I join them." He wrote nothing of her words in his report, but they remained with him, a truth he could not put aside. The artifact that survives from this time, the sheriff's official fire report, shows the tension plainly. Entire paragraphs are struck through, ink thickened where words were scratched out. What remains is terse, almost evasive. Fire caused by accident remains consistent with ancient habitation. Matter closed, yet in the margin, half erased, are notes in a smaller hand. Count exceeds 20. Bones not weathered, witnesses uneasy. These scraps, perhaps never meant to be seen, suggest a man caught between duty to truth and duty to survival. The contrast defined Clyne's burden. As sheriff, he was sworn to uphold the law. As a citizen, he lived in a county where law bent beneath the weight of wealth. He was caught between conscience and complicity, between the pull of justice and the demand for silence. To speak openly risked not only his position but his family's safety. To remain silent meant carrying the knowledge of the pit alone. In later years, when his private papers were examined after his death, fragments of his unease surfaced. One scrap of a letter, never sent, reads, "The land speaks, but we are deaf by choice. Whitby has bought our silence and perhaps my soul with it. God forgive us, for the soil will not." The Whitby fire might have been forgotten altogether, if not for these traces of the sheriff's conscience. His hesitation, his unfinished words, stand as a rare window into the struggle of a man who recognized the darkness beneath the surface yet lacked the power or the courage to confront it. His burden was not only the weight of what he had seen, but the knowledge that he, too, became part of the silence that allowed it to continue. The arrival of Dr. Nathaniel Greaves in the county brought a new vocabulary to what many had long sensed but dared not name. Greaves was an alienist, a physician of the mind, as they were beginning to call the specialty, sent first to Richmond to study cases of moral derangement among prisoners. His reputation for methodical observation, for treating testimony not as gossip but as evidence of inner wounds, made him a figure of cautious interest. When word of the Whitby fire and its unsettling discoveries reached the state capital, it was decided that the matter warranted a detached eye. And so, in the autumn of 1841, Greaves rode into Whitby County, notebook in hand. He began where others would not, with the survivors. Not those in power, whose polished accounts already varnished the truth, but the enslaved who had been driven to labor at the fire line. He spoke with them quietly, often under cover of tending to minor ailments. In their guarded words, he heard a pattern. Several mentioned songs they had been forbidden to sing, songs that spoke of earth-swallowing voices, of barns that could not contain their secrets. One young man described the smell during the fire as unlike tobacco, thicker, sour, like a body left too long. Greaves recorded his testimony with clinical precision, noting physiological signs, trembling hands, averted eyes, shortness of breath. He treated these not as superstition but as indicators of trauma unacknowledged by the wider community. The overseers, when interviewed, spoke with rehearsed uniformity. They described the blaze as unfortunate but ordinary, the bones as relics from a forgotten tribe. Greaves noted the identical phrasing in their statements, the same cadence of dismissal, as though the words had been rehearsed under instruction. One even repeated Whitby's own phrase, ancient habitation, as though quoting scripture. Greaves found this too neat, too carefully arranged to be credible. He wrote in his journal, "Truth rarely repeats itself with such precision. Lies, however, are eager to echo." In his exploration of the ruined barn, Greaves discovered something others had overlooked: scraps of cloth and iron, warped by heat, mixed among the soil and bone. One fragment appeared to be from a shoe, another a belt buckle bearing initials that were no longer legible. These were not remnants of a vanished tribe. They were objects of recent manufacture, things a living man or woman might have worn within the last decade. He pressed the sheriff to catalog these finds, but Clyne demurred, citing jurisdictional limits. The fragments quietly vanished into storage, never entered into the county's official record. Perhaps most haunting were the accounts Greaves collected from children. One boy of 8, pressed into carrying water the night of the fire, spoke of voices beneath the crackling, as though the blaze had not consumed silence but released it. Another described seeing his mother fall to her knees, covering her face as the pit opened, whispering a name Greaves could not clearly record. In these children's memories, Greaves saw the echo of intergenerational fear, passed down as song, gesture, silence. He noted, "What is carried in a child's testimony is not invention but inheritance. The trauma of the soil seeps into the bloodline." The artifact that survives from Greaves's visit is his journal, housed now in the State Medical College. Written in a hand both neat and unyielding, it contains sketches of the burned barn, diagrams of bone placement as described by witnesses, and fragments of testimony recorded verbatim. One page reads of voices under fire. "Bones too white for age." Overseers speak in chorus. "Sheriff weary, fearful." "The land is a mouth refusing to stay shut." The journal's marginalia reveal his growing conviction that the Whitby estate was sustained, not merely by human labor but by human sacrifice, whether deliberate or concealed beneath the guise of punishment and neglect. Greaves's presence introduced a new contrast into the county's silence. Science versus superstition, clinical observation against willful denial, where ministers had spoken of fire as divine judgment, and neighbors of accidents and tribes. Greaves spoke of patterns, of evidence, of testimonies that pointed to something systematically concealed. Yet his authority was fragile. He was not a magistrate nor a man of property. He was an outsider whose notes might be dismissed as theory. Still, his careful handwriting, his insistence on detail, gave weight to what the community preferred to bury. In the weeks that followed, Whitby himself began to show irritation at the alienist's inquiries. Servants were warned against speaking. Overseers closed ranks. Rumors spread that Greaves was a meddler, a man of unwholesome curiosity. Yet his journal entries reveal a steady resolve. If silence is purchased by fear, then fear is the true currency of this county, and Whitby is rich indeed. Greaves left before winter, summoned back to Richmond by his superiors. Officially, his report was filed as inconclusive, for without county records to corroborate his observations, he could not prove the scale of what he had seen, but his journal remained, its pages a quiet indictment. For those who would later reopen the Whitby case, his notes became a cornerstone, evidence that at least one trained observer had recognized the pattern and had the courage to write it down. The true breakthrough in understanding the Whitby lineage did not come from testimony or memory, but from the ledgers, those seemingly mundane books of numbers and accounts in which Whitby's fortune was recorded line by line. For decades they sat unremarked in the estate's storehouse, bound in leather and dust, until the 1842 inventory after the barn fire brought them briefly into public view. What appeared at first to be ordinary records of crops, purchases, and sales contained beneath their columns of figures a hidden language, one that revealed more about Whitby's methods than any confession ever would. The ledgers were kept meticulously, Each season's yield of tobacco tallied against expenditures for labor, tools, feed, and shipments to Richmond. On the surface, they confirmed the family's reputation for diligence and prosperity. But interspersed among the entries were marks that puzzled even the most seasoned. Clerks, small crosses in the margins, letters placed where numbers should be, occasional notations in Latin rather than English. Sheriff Clyne had noticed them during his cursory review after the fire, but dismissed them as bookkeeping eccentricities. It was Dr. Greaves, in one of his final days in the county, who suggested they might be a code. Years later, when these books resurfaced in a courthouse box mislabeled miscellaneous, and scholars began to decode their meaning. The crosses did not signify expenses or credits. They marked disappearances. Each one corresponded, when cross-checked with plantation lists, to an enslaved person no longer accounted for. Some were sold southward, some officially recorded as escaped, but the number of crosses far exceeded what could be reconciled. Next to several crosses appeared short Latin phrases. Terra accepit, the earth has taken. Sub umbra, beneath the shadow. These were not the words of commerce, but of concealment. Most chilling of all were the notations in a faint, cramped hand on the inside covers of the ledgers. They seemed to be lists of initials, grouped by season, followed by figures too small to be monetary amounts. One page read simply, MAJTDH3, followed by a cross and the word quietus. Whether these were the names of the dead, the vanished, or those selected for punishment, no one could say. But their presence gave shape to what had long been whispered, that the soil of the Whitby estate contained more than crops, that its prosperity was fertilized by human loss. An artifact that survives in facsimile is a single torn page from the 1839 ledger, preserved now in the state archives. In its upper corner is an entry for 500 lbs tobacco, Richmond, but in the margin beside it appears a symbol resembling a spade. Below, in Latin, the words non numerantur, they are not counted. The handwriting is steady, deliberate. To any bookkeeper it would appear an oddity. To those who knew of the pit beneath the barn, it was damning. The contrast here is stark. Numbers meant to ensure transparency instead became veils of secrecy. Books designed to preserve order became instruments of concealment. What the law sought in depositions and sworn testimony, the truth had already confessed in ink and parchment. The ledgers did not speak of commerce alone. They spoke of a system that calculated human life alongside bales of leaf and marked those lives expendable when they no longer served. For the community, these revelations did not come at once. Only fragments circulated at first, whispered by clerks or hinted at by ministers who dared to glance at the pages. Some dismissed them as clerical errors, others as fabrications by those eager to tarnish a prosperous name. Yet for the enslaved, who had long carried knowledge of disappearances in their memories and songs, the ledgers were proof. They had been saying for years that the soil took what Whitby demanded. Now the very books he used to parade his wealth contained the same testimony. It was this discovery that gave Greaves his final conviction before departing. The estate is both field and graveyard, he wrote, and its records are scripture of the same, though his report would be filed as inconclusive. His private notes made clear that the ledgers were more damning than the barn pit itself. Fire had revealed bones. Ink revealed intent. When decades later historians pieced together the Whitby case, it was the ledgers that became the hinge of argument. They showed not only that disappearances were real, but that they were recorded with chilling regularity, as though folded into the ordinary business of farming. The books made denial impossible. They turned rumor into record, memory into evidence. The unmarked soil of Whitby's estate had been whispered about in fear. The ledgers proved that silence was not ignorance, it was design. Each cross, each phrase, each set of initials was a signature on the contract between wealth and death. The ledgers once whispered about could not be unseen. They circulated in fragments at first, copies of pages, made hastily by a clerk who feared discovery, notes in Greaves's journal, recollections whispered to sympathetic ministers. By the spring of 1842, the county could no longer pretend that the Whitby estate was unblemished. Tension gathered in the air like summer thunder. The sheriff, weary and compromised, finally bowed to pressure from a faction of magistrates and landholders who feared that continued silence would endanger their own reputations. A decision was made. Halting and cautious, there would be a search of the Whitby grounds. It was not called a raid, though that was what it became. Sheriff Clyne assembled a small group of deputies, 2 magistrates and a surveyor. The party rode out at dawn, their intent cloaked in official language, to review boundaries, to confirm records, but everyone knew what they sought. Word spread quickly. The enslaved whispered of it in the cabins, while overseers kept close watch, armed and stiff. Whitby himself received the men with a mask of civility. He invited them into the house, offered tobacco and spirits, and spoke as though nothing were amiss. His composure was a performance polished by years of wealth and authority. But when the sheriff requested access to the northern fields, Whitby's jaw tightened, his hand clenching the back of a chair. The group moved outward nonetheless, accompanied by reluctant overseers. They began with the sight of the burned barn, where the earth still bore black scars. The surveyor took notes, measuring distances, marking irregularities in the ground. Behind the men, a cluster of enslaved children watched from the edges of the fields, their eyes wide, their faces unreadable. Whitby walked among the party like a host guiding guests through a parlor, his every word measured. Here we planted wheat after the fire. The soil runs stony here, but beneath his calm, there was tension, like a rope drawn taut. Then came the moment of discovery. Near a hedgerow at the edge of the fields, the surveyor's rod struck earth that yielded too easily. A hollow sound rose from beneath, distinct, undeniable. Deputies exchanged glances. One knelt, scooping away soil until his fingers struck something smooth, curved. It was bone, pale and unmistakable. The ground had been disturbed before, tamped hastily, but time and weather had begun to expose what lay beneath. Sheriff Clyne stood motionless, his face drained of color. The magistrates muttered about ancient burials, the same refrain as before. But the deputies knew what they had seen. Whitby stepped forward then, his voice louder than before, laced with command. "You trespass beyond your commission. This is my land, and I will not have it." Desecrated by idle spades, his composure cracked for the first time, a flicker of fury breaking through the mask. One overseer laid a hand on his musket, and the tension became nearly unbearable. Deputies hesitated, caught between authority of law and fear of power. Clyne, perhaps recalling the erased lines in his own report, raised a hand and ordered the party back. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking. "This is no fit place for us to dig without further sanction." The confrontation ended not in discovery, but in retreat. The group withdrew to the courthouse, carrying only the memory of the hollow ground and the glimpse of pale bone. Officially, the incident was recorded as inconclusive. A disturbance of soil near the northern hedgerow, not pursued for want of jurisdiction. Unofficially, it confirmed every whisper. The land itself resisted silence, and the men sent to uphold law had flinched from it. For the enslaved who witnessed the morning's events, the contrast was searing. Lawmen who dared scrape the soil but stopped when threatened, versus Whitby who ruled with silence and fear. For the community, it became a story retold in fragments, how close the truth came to surfacing, and how swiftly it was buried again. For Sheriff Clyne, it was another burden added to his already weighted conscience. His notes from that night, preserved in his private papers, are brief but telling. We nearly unearthed it, but the living were more dangerous than the dead. My courage failed. This near confrontation was the high water mark of institutional resistance. The county had made a gesture toward justice, only to recoil at the threshold. Whitby's fortune remained untouched. His barns rebuilt, his crops sold as before. But from that day, even his allies could not fully meet his gaze. They had seen what the soil contained, and though they denied it in public, the memory of bone beneath earth walked with them, unspoken, like a specter. The raid that was not a raid revealed both the possibility of truth and the impossibility of power confronting it. It showed the contrast in its starkest form, the law at the edge of revelation, the land begging to speak, and silence once again imposed, not by ignorance but by fear. In the weeks that followed the aborted search of the Whitby grounds, a heavy quiet settled over the county. It was not the calm of resolution but the smothered silence of fear. What had been glimpsed at the hedgerow, the hollow strike of the surveyor's rod, the pale curve of exposed bone, was spoken of in cautious whispers, then spoken of less, then not spoken of at all. Those who had been present at the site avoided one another's eyes in church pews. The magistrates, who had muttered of ancient burials, doubled down on that explanation, repeating it so often that it began to sound rehearsed even to their own ears. Officially, the matter ended with a series of sealed records. The courthouse received instructions from Richmond. The incident was to be recorded as inconclusive, the fire attributed to accident, and no further surveys authorized without state sanction. The files were bound in a thin sheaf labeled Miscellaneous, Barn Fire, 1841, and tucked into an archive drawer. In later decades, when historians attempted to piece together the events, they found these records heavily redacted, entire pages missing, signatures blotted into illegibility. It was not merely neglect, it was erasure. For Sheriff Clyne, the sealing of the records was both a relief and a torment. Relief because the burden of decision was taken from him, and torment because he knew what was being hidden. His deputies reported that he spent more and more time in his office, staring at the courthouse walls as though they might open to reveal the truth he had failed to pursue. He wrote no more official notes, but scraps from his private diary survive. One line reads simply, "The silence is heavier than any coffin." Another, "If we bury the truth, the earth will not forget." Whitby, for his part, moved swiftly to reassert control. He ordered new barns constructed, larger than the ones that had burned, as if to demonstrate his prosperity remained unshaken. He extended generous loans to neighboring planters, ensuring their dependence on his wealth, and he hosted a series of dinners at the estate, where magistrates and ministers dined at his table, their laughter carrying across the fields. These gestures, polished in public, served to drown out the murmurs of dissent. By seating the county's leaders beneath his roof, Whitby turned potential critics into guests, silencing them with hospitality. The enslaved, however, remembered. For them, silence was not safety but necessity, a shield against punishment. Yet memory took root in songs, in stories told by firelight, in careful warnings passed to children. They sang of bones beneath barns, of fields that fed on more than crops, of voices trapped in the earth. These songs were dismissed by overseers as nonsense hymns, but they carried the truth across generations. The contrast between official silence and private memory became the defining feature of the Whitby legacy. In the courthouse, the incident was a closed file, a non-event. In the cabins, it was a wound, an unhealed scar that bled into lullabies and whispered prayers. The county presented to the outside world the image of prosperity and order, while within its soil lay disorder, violence, and fear. Years later, when one of the ledgers resurfaced in a courthouse drawer, scholars noted how neatly the suppression had been executed. Every official account ended before discovery. Every deposition aligned with Whitby's version of events. The absence of contradiction was itself suspicious. "Too clean," one historian wrote. "Too harmonious. Truth is never so smooth." The aftermath proved the institution's fragility. Law meant to reveal and preserve truth, instead colluded with silence. Faith meant to comfort, preached sermons that avoided the soil beneath their congregants' feet. Neighbors, meant to hold one another accountable, chose to look away. Whitby did not need to erase the past alone. The county itself assisted, sealing files and sealing lips. Yet even sealed, the records left traces, smudges of erased ink, names half scratched out, margins left blank where more should have been written. These traces, like bones exposed by fire, were reminders that silence was never complete. Something always leaked through. And for those who returned to the Whitby case decades later, these small leaks became rivers. The suppression of 1842 was not an end, but an interlude, a pause that allowed the estate to continue in prosperity. But silence, like soil, cannot contain what is restless. The land had spoken once in fire and again in the hollow ground. Those who had chosen silence would find in time that the truth demanded another reckoning. By the time winter gave way to spring in 1843, the silence surrounding the Whitby estate had begun to fray, not in the courthouse, where the files remained bound and sealed, but in the currents of rumor that slipped through taverns, markets, and churchyards. The story of the fire and the bones beneath. The barn had traveled farther than the county's magistrates intended. Teamsters carrying tobacco to Richmond whispered of it along the road. Traders repeated fragments in distant markets. A barn burned, bones uncovered. A sheriff who would not dig further. Like all rumors, the tale warped in retelling, but its persistence revealed what the sealed records could not erase. A suspicion that something rotten lay beneath the Whitby wealth. In Richmond, the whispers took on sharper edges. The state assembly, already concerned with maintaining Virginia's reputation in the face of growing northern criticism of slavery, did not welcome tales of mass graves on a prosperous estate. Some members dismissed the matter, outright as abolitionist. Invention, the work of agitators, eager to smear Virginia's planters. Yet others quietly, cautiously asked questions. How many disappearances had truly been recorded in the county? What did the sheriff's sealed file contain? These questions never reached the floor of debate, but they circulated in private corridors, troubling those who understood that prosperity, built on unmarked soil, was a fragile shield against scandal. Whitby himself recognized the danger. He extended his influence beyond the county, investing in warehouses along the James River, positioning himself as indispensable to Richmond's tobacco trade. By intertwining his wealth with the city's economy, he ensured that any attack on his estate would be felt by merchants and shippers alike. Yet for all his outward power, the rumors gnawed at his name. Ministers in neighboring counties began to avoid mentioning him in sermons of virtue. Families whispered about whether their daughters ought to visit Whitby's estate for dances. A fissure had opened. Whitby was still powerful, but no longer untouchable. The enslaved, too, carried the rumors outward. Some who were sold to other counties repeated the songs of the barns, the whispers of bones beneath fields. These fragments of testimony, though dismissed by many whites as superstition, spread like seeds on the wind. By the late 1840s, collectors of slave songs would note eerie verses from the region, lines that spoke of fire in the ground and masters who feed the soil. Though veiled in metaphor, they were echoes of lived memory, preserved against the erasures of official record. Sheriff Clyne, increasingly withdrawn, found himself caught in the middle of this widening tension. Deputies reported that he declined to attend Whitby's dinners and refused to discuss the matter of the fire in public. Privately, however, he wrote in his papers of his fear that the matter will not remain buried, neither by soil nor by ink. He understood that suppression had bought the county time, not absolution. The contrast haunted him. Men in Richmond debating abstractions of reputation, while he had stood in the field and heard the hollow sound of spade against grave. An artifact from this period is a letter preserved in the archives of a Richmond merchant. Dated May 1843, it reads, "There is talk of Whitby in the city, none of it wholesome. Some say his fortune is watered not by river but by blood. I cannot say if true, but I will say this. Tobacco that passes through his barns tastes bitterer than most." The letter, though casual in tone, demonstrates how suspicion had seeped into commerce itself. Whitby's name had become a flavor, his wealth tinged with unease. The contrast at this stage was no longer confined to the county. Locally, silence reigned, with magistrates and ministers upholding Whitby's innocence. Regionally, however, suspicion was a currency traded freely, reshaping how outsiders viewed the estate. The closer one was to Whitby's wealth, the more silence was demanded. The farther away, the more open the doubts became. This spread of rumor marked the first real crack in Whitby's invulnerability. It showed that while records could be sealed and deputies silenced, stories could not be contained. Once released, they traveled beyond the reach of wealth and authority, growing in the telling, forcing even those who wished to remain ignorant to reckon with the question, what, precisely, had been buried in Whitby soil? The county could bury bones. It could bury reports, but it could not bury suspicion. That seed had taken root, and in time it would grow stronger than the barns, the ledgers, or the silence of men sworn to look away. By the summer of 1844, the Whitby estate was again the stage for unease. This time it was not a fire or a ledger, but a disappearance that stirred whispers into sharper fear. The missing man was named Isaac, a young enslaved laborer known for his strength in the fields and his quiet habit of carving small wooden figures in the evenings. Isaac's absence was first explained in the usual terms. He had run off. Such explanations were common, convenient, and often unquestioned. But this time the story failed to settle. Isaac had been seen the very evening before his disappearance, working under overseer supervision as the sun set. He was tired but steady, carrying baskets of leaf. At dawn, when the workers were called, his place was empty. No tracks were found, no stolen horse, no sign of flight. The overseer recorded him as an absconded hand, yet his fellow laborers whispered that Isaac had been summoned to the north field the night before, called away quietly, without reason. The contrast between official record and lived memory sharpened suspicion. Overseers swore to Whitby that Isaac must have fled, perhaps seeking the underground railroad that many whispered about but few dared to believe was real. But among the enslaved, songs shifted. They added a new verse. The strong one went walking. The soil took him whole. These words, simple and haunting, carried the weight of collective memory. Isaac had not escaped. He had been consumed. Sheriff Clyne heard of the disappearance and, against his instincts, rode once more to the estate. He questioned the overseer, who repeated the rehearsed line about escape. He questioned Whitby himself, who looked him in the eye and said, "If Isaac fled, he will be found. If not, he will be forgotten. Either way, he no longer belongs here." Clyne recorded these words in his notes, though he would later strike them through, as though ashamed to have preserved them. In the following weeks, Isaac's name vanished from the plantation rolls. A cross appeared in the margin of Whitby's ledger, beside the season's tobacco yield, with the Latin phrase absentia quieta, absence at rest. This phrase, too, was found decades later. When the ledgers were decoded, and scholars matched it against oral histories that spoke of Isaac's sudden vanishing, what the ledger called rest, the songs called soil, both pointed to the same fate. Rumors again spilled beyond the estate. This was no faceless grave revealed by fire, no old record unearthed in archives. This was a man known to the community, whose wooden carvings had been sold at market, whose presence had been steady. His sudden absence forced even the most reluctant neighbors to wonder. A Richmond merchant wrote in his diary, "Another hand gone from Whitby. They say he ran north, but I suspect he lies no farther than a spade's depth below." For the enslaved, Isaac's disappearance was a warning. They whispered that those who resisted too openly, or who knew too much, were taken to the fields at night and never returned. The ground, they said, was hungrier than the overseers. Mothers hushed their children with stories of Isaac, not as an escapee, but as one swallowed by earth itself. His name became less a person than a caution, a reminder that survival meant silence. The county again looked away. With no body, no evidence beyond rumor, officials dismissed the matter as an unfortunate flight. Newspapers never carried Isaac's name. Yet the contrast deepened. On paper, he was a runaway, a statistic among many. In memory, he was proof that Whitby's estate was not merely a place of labor, but of disappearance. In later years, when Isaac's name was pieced together from ledgers and oral histories, his story became central to the pattern. Fire had revealed bones. Ledgers had revealed code. Now a man's sudden vanishing tied the living directly to the soil's hunger. Each incident escalated the unease, pulling Whitby's fortune further into shadow. Isaac's carvings, one of which, a small figure of a bird, survives in a private collection, remain his only tangible legacy. To those who study the case now, the bird is a bitter emblem, an image of flight carved by a man who never escaped. By 1846, the unease surrounding the Whitby estate had ripened into something that demanded outside scrutiny. The sheriff's silence could no longer contain it, nor could Whitby's careful investments in warehouses and Richmond markets erase the undercurrent of dread. It was at this point that Dr. Alistair Hume, an alienist from Philadelphia who had once corresponded with Virginia's medical colleges, was invited, quietly, unofficially, to review the matter. Hume was known not only for his study of mental afflictions, but also for his belief that repeated incidents, whether of madness or violence, revealed patterns if one looked with cold precision. Hume arrived with little ceremony, staying not at Whitby's estate but in a boarding house in the county seat. From the beginning, his manner set him apart from the magistrates and planters. He asked no questions about profit or yield, only about dates, names, and silences. His first task was to review the sheriff's sealed file. Clyne, weary and perhaps eager to share his burden, allowed him access under the promise that nothing would be made public without consent. What Hume found in the file were the same contradictions that had haunted Clyne for years: bones in the ash of the barn, ledgers written in code, testimonies from enslaved men and women hastily struck from the record. To Hume, the contrast was telling: a county desperate to declare the matter finished, and a ledger that refused to close. He copied carefully the fragments of Latin that had appeared beside crop. Intris, absentia quieta, terra accepit, satis redditum. He noted the rhythm of these phrases, each linked to a season, each coinciding with the disappearance of a name from the rolls. To a magistrate, they might appear as pious notes. To an alienist attuned to patterns of obsession, they spoke of a compulsion, a ritual almost. where the language of the dead was woven into the language of prophet. Hume then sought testimony from those who had been closest to the estate but were no longer bound to it. In Richmond he found two men who had been sold from the Whitby plantation in the 1830s. They recalled with unease the disappearances of companions, the whispered verses of Isaac's fate, the long nights when smoke rose from barns though no curing was scheduled. Their memories were halting, shaped by fear in the passage of years, but their consistency troubled Hume. "It is not madness that stalks the Whitby estate," he wrote in his notes, "but method, repetition disguised as misfortune." An artifact from this stage survives in Hume's hand, a chart he drafted that aligns the estate's highest yield years with the recorded absences. In the margins he scrawled, "Soil nourished by more than rain." Each gain corresponds to loss, yet the ledgers mask it as providence. This chart, preserved in a university archive, is one of the earliest analytical attempts to tie Whitby's fortune not to industry or innovation, but to disappearance. Whitby himself met Hume only once, in a charged encounter arranged by the magistrates. Whitby dismissed the alienists' questions with the calm superiority of a man accustomed to power. "Men vanish," he said. "Some by choice, some by judgment, some by the hand of providence. The soil keeps what it will, doctor, and no man commands it but God." Hume recorded this statement verbatim, adding only, spoken with a serenity too great for innocence. The contrast could not have been starker. Whitby's invocation of divine will against Hume's insistence on human agency, profit, and calculation. Yet despite Hume's findings, no tribunal was formed. His notes were circulated quietly among a few colleagues in Philadelphia, but Virginia's authorities refused to sanction his inquiries further. For them, Whitby was still too valuable, his tobacco still too essential to Richmond's trade. The alienist left the county, his warnings unheard by those with the power to act. But his writings endured, sealed in academic papers and private correspondence, waiting for a time when posterity would listen more closely than Whitby's peers had. In the narrative of escalation, this was the turning point where suspicion became analysis. The bones had been discovered, the disappearances mourned in whispers, but now there was a system, a chart, a pattern drawn with ink and logic. Hume's cold, clinical prose gave the unease a form that even Whitby's defenders could not wholly dismiss. Though ignored in his own day, his work stands as one of the earliest attempts to hold a planter accountable not by hearsay, but by the arithmetic of loss. It also deepened the moral tension. Was the estate merely cursed by misfortune, as Whitby insisted, or was it deliberately feeding on the lives of those who worked its soil? Hume never offered a final answer, but his words set the stage for later generations to see the Whitby story not as isolated tragedies, but as part of a deliberate architecture of silence, profit, and human cost, the most enduring legacy of Dr. Alistair. Hume's inquiry lies not in his reputation, obscure in his own century, barely remembered by his colleagues, but in the papers he left behind. Among them was a packet labeled Whitby Ledger Study, sealed with wax and later discovered in the collection of a Philadelphia Medical Society. Within were pages of careful transcription, columns of numbers, and passages of Latin phrases copied directly from Whitby's account books. These notes, clinical in their precision, have become the closest thing to proof that the Whitby fortune was bound to more than honest soil. At the center of the packet was a chart. Across the top, Hume had written the years 1828 through 1844. Down the side, he marked the plantation's yield of tobacco in hogsheads. In a third column, he recorded what he called absence notations, the phrases, Whitby scrawled beside certain years, absentia quieta, absence at rest, terra accepit, the earth has received, satis reddidum, enough repaid. Hume then drew lines linking years of highest yield with the phrases in question. Every peak in the estate's prosperity coincided with a notation of disappearance. In the margin of one page, Hume wrote in a hand almost feverish, "This is not coincidence. These marks, scattered though they appear, form a code of equivalence. For every rise of fortune, there is a vanishing of flesh." The soil to Whitby, his ledger and altar both. His words were not those of a man dazzled by superstition, but of a physician trained to recognize patterns of behavior. To him, Whitby's code was evidence of ritual, whether born of piety, madness, or cold calculation. He could not say. Other artifacts preserved in the packet gave flesh to the chart. One was a copied line from Whitby's ledger itself. Dated autumn 1839, yield 30 hogsheads, absentia quieta. Another, from 1842, yield 36 hogsheads. Terra accepit. The handwriting, unmistakably Whitby's, confirmed that these phrases were not invention but record. It is in these entries that the contrast emerges. Most starkly, profit and loss entwined, harvest and disappearance written in the same breath. To the world, Whitby's account book spoke of abundance. To Hume, it whispered of cost. Accompanying these transcriptions were Hume's own reflections. In one, he noted, "When asked, Whitby invoked providence." But the repetition of these phrases suggests not a passive belief in divine will, but an active doctrine that the earth must be fed for gain to be reaped. If superstition, it is calculated. If faith, it is cruel. Here, Hume forced a confrontation between explanation and implication. Was Whitby a man so gripped by ritual that he believed disappearances were necessary sacrifices, or was the language of sacrifice a mask for deliberate violence committed in pursuit of wealth? The packet also contained testimonies that Hume had attempted to preserve before they slipped away. One was a fragment from a former enslaved man in Richmond, recorded secondhand. "He called us to field when moon was high. We did not see Isaac again. Overseer say he run, but soil was soft there for days." Another fragment, transcribed from a woman sold to another county. "They say barn fires showed what ground already knew. We sing of it, though we are told not to." These words, fragile and filtered through many hands, still breathe the truth of memory, offered not as courtroom evidence, but as human witness. Together, these artifacts formed what Hume believed to be a case study of ritualized exploitation. His notes did not claim certainty, but they pointed toward a terrifying symmetry, each increase in Whitby's prosperity mirrored by the quiet removal of a life. If coincidence, it was grotesque. If design, it was monstrous. Either way, the pattern refused dismissal. The power of these documents lies not only in their content, but in their suppression. Hume's colleagues dismissed the study as speculation. Virginia's magistrates ignored it altogether. For nearly a century, the packet lay buried in academic archives, cited only in footnotes until modern historians reopened the file. It is in this contrast between the silence of the 19th century and the scrutiny of the present that the Whitby case gains its resonance. What was once overlooked as idle theory is now seen as the closest glimpse into how the Whitby fortune was built. The question lingers, sharpened by Hume's meticulous handwriting. If wealth is recorded in ledgers and lives are recorded in absence, what balance sheet of morality remains? The Whitby estate flourished. The names of Isaac, Josiah, and so many others did not. Profit and loss are never neutral when both are drawn from human flesh. By 1847, tension that had long simmered beneath the surface of the county finally broke into confrontation. For years, rumors had been dismissed as superstition, the whispers of enslaved people or the bitter talk of rival planners. But Isaac's disappearance and the murmurs surrounding Whitby's coded ledgers had stirred unease even among those who once defended him. The sheriff's reluctance, Hume's withdrawn warnings, and the persistence of songs and rumors made silence untenable. It was not abolitionists from the North who first forced a reckoning, but Whitby's own neighbors, men who feared that association with his estate would tarnish their names, and women who whispered that their sons were being drawn into darkness too great to ignore. The catalyst was small, almost mundane. A traveling tinker passing through the county claimed to have seen bones in a freshly tilled field on the Whitby land. His words spread quickly in the tavern, sharpened by drink, and by dusk, a cluster of men had resolved to see for themselves. They were not abolitionists, nor reformers. They were farmers, tradesmen, and overseers, men who had tolerated slavery as the order of things, but now feared that Whitby's practices endangered the fragile balance of community reputation. The difference was subtle but crucial. They did not act out of pity, but out of dread. On a moonless night they gathered, half a dozen men carrying lanterns and spades, accompanied reluctantly by Sheriff Clyne. The sheriff had argued against the expedition, but when pressed he yielded, knowing that refusal would only deepen suspicion of his loyalty to Whitby. They approached the estate from the north, avoiding the main road, their boots muffled against the soft soil. for the enslaved who watched them pass in silence. It was a moment of terrible hope and fear. Would the white men truly dig into the ground that had long been forbidden, or would they vanish like the rest? The barn stood quiet, its frame rebuilt since the fire years earlier. But the men did not stop there. They crossed into the western field, where the soil had been turned more recently than others. Lantern light flickered against furrows, and for a long moment no one moved. Then, with a muttered curse, one man drove his spade into the earth. The sound, hollow as though against wood or bone, froze the others. When he lifted the blade again, clumps of dirt fell away to reveal something pale. A fragment of jaw, a tooth still lodged in it. The reaction was swift and chaotic. Some staggered back, crossing themselves. Others cursed and dug more furiously. Within minutes, the lanterns illuminated a shallow pit where fragments of ribs, long bones, and cloth scraps surfaced. There was no denying what lay beneath them. The soil was not merely fertile, it was fed. It was at this moment that Whitby himself appeared, accompanied by 2 overseers. His voice, calm and commanding, cut through the frantic digging. "You desecrate my fields," he said. "This land is consecrated by toil, not by gossip. Put down your spades." His tone was not pleading, but threatening, as though he were the aggrieved party, not the man standing above a pit of bones. The contrast could not have been clearer. Men holding shovels that proved the whispers true, confronted by a master whose wealth and authority still shielded him. Sheriff Clyne, trembling, tried to assert order, warning both sides that violence would serve no one. Yet the air was thick with menace. Lanterns swung, overseers tightened their grips on rifles, and for a moment it seemed that blood would be spilled on soil already heavy with it. What followed is disputed in every surviving account. Some claim Whitby ordered his men to fire, though no shots rang out. Others insist the crowd was too fearful to press further, scattering when Whitby advanced. What is certain is that the pit was left open, the bones hastily covered again, and the men dispersed before dawn. By morning, Whitby's overseers had filled the hole completely, sowing fresh seed over the disturbed earth. To any passerby, the field appeared untouched. The raid, or confrontation, as later records call it, achieved nothing official. No charges were filed. No tribunal was convened, yet its symbolic weight was immense. The men who had dug that night carried the memory with them, and though they spoke of it rarely, the knowledge poisoned their allegiance to Whitby. They had seen with their own eyes what the songs had long claimed. They knew the ground kept its secrets not by chance, but by design. For the enslaved, the event brought a cruel irony. Proof had been unearthed, but no justice followed. The pit was closed, the bones buried deeper, and life resumed as though nothing had happened. Still, the memory of white men digging beside them and recoiling offered a grim validation. The truth had not only been theirs to bear, it had been forced upon others, if only for a single night. This was the high point of confrontation, when silence cracked open and then swiftly closed again. What should have been revelation became repression once more. Yet the county was never the same. From that night onward, Whitby's fields bore not just the crops of tobacco, but the burden of knowledge shared across color and class, a knowledge that would linger, corrosive and unresolved, long after Whitby himself was gone. In the weeks that followed the midnight confrontation, the county settled into a silence more deliberate and suffocating than before. What had been rumor was now knowledge, and knowledge carried danger. The men who had dug into the field spoke of it only once, behind closed doors, swearing to each other that they would never put their names to paper, never give their wives or children reason to repeat what they had seen. For them, the cost of speaking was ruin, social, economic, perhaps even mortal. Whitby was too deeply entangled in the tobacco market, too closely allied with Richmond merchants and county magistrates. To accuse him openly would be to accuse the very order on which their livelihoods depended. Sheriff Clyne filed a report of the night's events, but it was brief, clinical, and conspicuously incomplete. He noted only that an unauthorized gathering disturbed the Whitby estate, and that no further unrest occurred. There was no mention of the spades, the lanterns, or the bones. His official narrative reduced a moment of revelation to a footnote of trespass. The fuller account, written in his private journal, told a different story. I saw with my own eyes what the earth yielded. The men with me saw as well, and yet we chose to cover it once more. The silence we keep may prove heavier than the soil itself. This entry, preserved in his family papers, would not surface until decades later. Whitby acted swiftly to contain the damage. Within days, he hosted a dinner for several magistrates and leading planters, offering them generous contracts for the coming season. He spoke with eloquence of providence, of the need for unity against outside slander, and of his devotion to Virginia's prosperity. His words were accompanied by gifts, barrels of tobacco, promises of investment, even quiet loans. By the evening's end, the magistrates had agreed to strike any record of disturbance from county files. In its place, a sealed docket was created, labeled only Property Trespass 1847. This suppression extended beyond official records. The county newspaper, which had briefly prepared a column about unrest near the Whitby plantation, withdrew the story at the request of its sponsors. Church sermons made no mention of the confrontation, though ministers had heard whispers from their congregants. The silence was total, deliberate, and enforced. Those who spoke too freely found themselves ostracized, their debts suddenly called in, their names excluded from contracts. The county itself became an accomplice in burying the truth alongside the bones. Yet the memory of that night endured in private. Among the enslaved, it was remembered as the digging, a moment when white men had finally touched the horror they had long endured. The story passed from mouth to mouth, altered and embellished, but always rooted in the same image: lantern light over open earth, bone gleaming where tobacco should have lain. It became a parable of futility, proof unearthed and then silenced again. For the men who had wielded the spades, the memory was corrosive. One, a miller by trade, confessed to his brother years later, "I thought I had strong hands, but when I held that jawbone, I could not hold my supper for 3 nights, and still I did nothing." Another, on his deathbed, whispered to his son, "Never trust the soil there. It takes more than it gives." These private testimonies, gathered by descendants in the 20th century, attest to the moral weight carried by men who saw and chose to bury, who became complicit in their silence. The contrast between public record and private memory became the defining feature of the aftermath. On paper, the county was orderly, the estate prosperous, the disturbance forgotten. In truth, the community lived with a fracture it dared not name. Knowledge of bones beneath the fields and a pact of silence to keep them hidden. The suppression was not passive ignorance but active choice, a collective agreement that prosperity outweighed truth. Institutionally, the failure was complete. The sheriff had abdicated justice. The magistrates had erased evidence. The church had refused to speak, and the press had fallen silent. Each pillar of authority chose complicity over confrontation, preserving the illusion of stability while bearing the cost. Whitby's fortune continued to grow. His name still carried weight in Richmond, and the soil remained unmarked by any stone or record of the lives it had consumed. This was the price of silence, not merely the loss of justice for the dead, but the corrosion of the living. The county's conscience was sealed as tightly as its records, leaving future generations to inherit not only wealth, but guilt. The soil no longer belonged to the present. It had become a tomb shared by the past and the unspoken future. When George Whitby died in 1853, his passing was marked with solemnity befitting a man of stature. The county newspaper ran a brief obituary, praising his industrious management and devotion to the prosperity of Virginia. No mention was made of unrest, no hint of scandal. Pallbearers carried him to the churchyard in Richmond, where a marble headstone still stands. Weathered but legible, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." It is a cruel irony that a man whose fields were fed with silence was enshrined in words of purity. In the years that followed, the Whitby estate declined. The Civil War scattered its heirs, emancipation ended its labor system, and the soil itself grew tired. By the late 19th century, the plantation was divided, sold in parcels to smaller farmers. The great barns rotted, the main house collapsed in a storm, and the land returned to anonymity. Yet beneath the furrows, the graves remained, unmarked and unacknowledged. Farmers plowed over them unknowingly. Children played upon them without fear, and the bones that had once stirred dread were left to merge with the soil. What endured were the records, some sealed, some forgotten, some smuggled into private hands. Sheriff Clyne's private journal survived in his family, passed quietly from one generation to another until it was donated to an archive. In the 1920s, Dr. Hume's packet of transcriptions was rediscovered in a Philadelphia society in the 1930s, cataloged under miscellaneous case notes and scattered across Virginia. Descendants of the enslaved carried songs and fragments of stories, that spoke of the digging and the soil's hunger. These fragments, fragile and often dismissed, formed a counter-history against the polished marble of Whitby's grave. In the 20th century, scholars began to piece the fragments together. A historian in the 1950s noted the eerie correlations in Whitby's ledgers. In the 1970s, an oral history project recorded the songs of families who traced their ancestry to the Whitby plantation. By the 1990s, researchers cross-referenced Clyne's journals with county records and realized the extent of deliberate erasure. Files mislabeled, depositions struck, entire dockets reduced to single lines. Each discovery deepened the contrast between official silence and lived memory. The legacy of Whitby is not one of grandeur but of absence. His barns are gone, his wealth dissipated, his name remembered only in footnotes. What persists is the unmarked soil, the bones still beneath it, and the uneasy knowledge that prosperity was built upon bodies consigned to anonymity. The marble of his grave testifies to honor, while the earth testifies to something far darker. That dissonance is the true inheritance of the Whitby lineage, not fortune, but contradiction. For the community, the rediscovery of records forced uncomfortable reckonings. Local descendants of Whitby's family struggled with the revelation that their ancestors' wealth was inseparable from violence. Farmers working the same soil had to acknowledge that their prosperity might rest upon unmarked graves, and for the descendants of the enslaved, the records provided not closure but confirmation, proof that the songs of their grandparents had always spoken truth. The suppression of the 19th century ensured that justice was never done. Whitby faced no trial, the county bore no shame, the church offered no repentance. Yet the truth endured, stitched together by memory and archive. It is in that endurance that a different kind of reckoning lies, not punishment, but remembrance. If Whitby's fortune was forged in unmarked soil, then so too was the testimony of those who refused to let silence erase them. The epilogue is not merely historical but moral. What do we do when prosperity is revealed to be bound to atrocity? How do communities inherit both wealth and guilt? And what does it mean to live upon ground that may itself be a grave? These questions cannot be answered with ledgers or dockets. They demand reflection, empathy, and the refusal to let silence reign again. The Whitby story closes not with a resolution but with an invitation to remember that every unmarked field may hide a history, that every monument to prosperity may stand upon foundations of pain, and that truth, though buried, is never wholly lost. The soil speaks if we are willing to listen. There are stories that end with closure, and there are stories that end with silence. The account of the Whitby lineage does not offer the comfort of justice neatly served or memory respectfully tended. Instead, it confronts us with the unsettling truth that wealth, prestige, and survival were purchased at the expense of bodies denied even the dignity of a name. The soil of Virginia, like so many places across the world, still holds those secrets beneath its furrows, waiting for the living to decide whether silence will continue to shield the dead from acknowledgement, or whether courage will break that silence at last. The modern reader or listener confronts a choice very different from that faced by Sheriff Clyne or Dr. Hume. We are no longer bound to Whitby's social order or the magistrate's economy, yet we wrestle with a parallel dilemma. When atrocity is uncovered, do we integrate it into our collective story, or do we let it remain an uncomfortable footnote? To acknowledge the truth means to recognize that prosperity, heritage, even regional pride are not unblemished. To ignore it is to perpetuate the erasure that began with the shovel striking bone in that field. The contrast between remembering and forgetting, between inherited shame and chosen honesty remains as sharp now as it was in 1828. Ethical transparency requires saying plainly what earlier generations refused to. The Whitby fortune was constructed upon unfree labor and compounded by the concealment of human remains. The institutions that should have spoken, courts, churches, newspapers, chose instead to safeguard their own stability. Their failure reverberates through time as a warning. When institutions remain silent, it is the responsibility of individuals and communities to listen to the earth, to the records, to the songs that survived, and to insist that history be complete. Philosophically, the Whitby case leaves us with questions more haunting than any ghost story. If prosperity is stained at its origin, can it ever be cleansed? If silence has preserved peace for generations, what violence do we risk by speaking? And when we inherit both privilege and memory, What is our duty to those whose bones rest unmarked beneath our fields? These are not questions confined to Virginia in the 19th century. They echo in every community, where profit has been extracted at the expense of dignity, and where memory threatens to unmask the cost. For those who seek certainty, the Whitby lineage offers none. The graves remain where they were, the soil unmarked, the families left without closure. What we possess are fragments: a sheriff's conflicted journal, a doctor's cautious notes, the ledger entries where human lives appear as figures of credit and loss. Yet in these fragments lies the possibility of reckoning, if not resolution. To hold them, to read them, to share them, is itself an act of resistance against the silence that was meant to erase them. And so, as this investigation closes, we return to the soil itself, the unmarked, unsettled earth where wealth was grown and lives were hidden. It stands as both field and grave, sanctuary and wound, sustainer of life and keeper of death. To pass it by without knowledge is to perpetuate Whitby's victory. To look upon it with open eyes is to break the silence that bound an entire community for generations. As you reflect on this history, consider what ground you walk upon, what stories lie beneath your own hometown, your own heritage. What monuments stand in your community and whose names are absent from them? The past does not demand guilt, but it does demand recognition. To listen to the soil is to honor those denied the dignity of remembrance. The Whitby lineage ends not with marble epitaphs or sealed ledgers, but with a question to you. When truth lies buried beneath prosperity, will you choose to look away or will you choose to listen?